What if I told you that the very thing you're desperately clinging to is the exact thing destroying your mental health? Carl Jung discovered something terrifying about human psychology. Something that most people spend their entire lives running from. And here's the kicker: the harder you run from it, the more it controls you. Stay with me, because what I'm about to share will completely flip your understanding of why you suffer and, more importantly, how to stop. Jung called it the thing we refuse to let go of. And before you think this is just another self-help video telling you to just release and surrender, stop right there. Because what Jung discovered goes way deeper than that surface-level advice. He found that our inability to let go isn't just a personality quirk or a bad habit. It's actually hardwired into our psyche through something he called psychological complexes. And here's what's really messed up about it. But before we dive into that rabbit hole, let me ask you something. Right now, as you're watching this, what's that one thing in the back of your mind? That relationship, that job, that version of yourself you used to be, that dream that didn't work out? Feel that tightness in your chest when you think about it? That's not just emotion. That's your psyche literally imprisoning itself. Jung wasn't just theorizing when he talked about letting go. He lived it. After his famous break with Freud in 1913, Jung experienced what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. He literally had to let go of everything he thought he knew about psychology, about himself, about reality itself. And you know what happened? He nearly lost his mind. But here's the thing, and this is where it gets interesting. Jung realized that his mental breakdown wasn't a breakdown at all. It was a breakthrough. The moment he stopped fighting against the chaos and started letting go of his need to control it, something extraordinary happened. He discovered what would later become the foundation of analytical psychology. The idea that our psyche contains multiple autonomous systems that operate independently of our conscious will. Now, I know what you're thinking. Great, another guy telling me that my suffering is somehow good for me. But hold on, because Jung's discovery was way more practical than that philosophical nonsense. He found that our attachments to people, outcomes, identities, even our pain, create what he called energy-binding complexes. Think of these like psychological tumors. They feed off your life force, they grow stronger the more attention you give them, and they literally prevent you from becoming who you're meant to be. But here's what nobody talks about when they discuss Jung's work. These complexes don't just bind your energy. They actually rewrite your perception of reality. You literally cannot see clearly when you're attached to something. Your brain filters out information that contradicts what you want to believe. Jung discovered this through his word association experiments. He'd give patients a list of words and measure their response time and galvanic skin response. What he found was shocking. Certain words would create what he called complex indicators. The patient would take longer to respond, show physical stress reactions, and often give bizarre or emotionally charged responses. These weren't random reactions. They were signs that the word had activated an autonomous complex, a cluster of emotionally charged thoughts, feelings, and memories that operate like a separate personality within the psyche. And here's the kicker. Jung realized that these complexes are often built around things we refuse to let go of. That ex-partner who still triggers you years later? They've become part of a complex. That career disappointment you can't stop thinking about? Complex. That childhood trauma you keep reliving? Complex. Your attachments are literally creating separate personalities inside your mind that hijack your behavior when triggered. Now, here's where Jung's work gets really dark and really powerful. He discovered that everything we refuse to let go of is actually connected to our shadow, those parts of ourselves we've rejected, denied, or hidden away. And the stronger our attachment to something, the bigger the shadow lurking behind it. Jung spent years developing his understanding of shadow work, and it's probably his most misunderstood concept. Most people think the shadow is just our dark side, the anger, greed, and selfishness we try to hide. But Jung's shadow is way more complex than that. The shadow contains everything we've disowned about ourselves, not just the obviously negative traits, but also our unrealized potential, our suppressed creativity, our authentic desires that we've been taught to be ashamed of. Let me give you an example that'll probably hit close to home. You know that person you can't get over? The one you keep thinking about, keep checking their social media, keep hoping will come back? Jung would say that your attachment to them isn't really about them at all. It's about the shadow projection you've placed onto them. When you can't let go of someone, you're actually refusing to let go of the parts of yourself that you've projected onto them. Maybe they represented your shadow's desire for adventure, or spontaneity, or emotional expression that you've suppressed in yourself. And here's the really messed up part. The more you chase that external thing, the more you abandon the very qualities within yourself that you're actually seeking. Jung called this loss of soul. You literally lose pieces of your authentic self every time you refuse to let go of something that isn't serving you. But it gets worse. Jung discovered through his clinical work that these shadow projections don't just steal your energy. They actually prevent you from accessing what he called the self with a capital S. This isn't your ego self, the version of you that gets triggered and attached and needy. This is your deeper, wiser, more integrated self. The self that can handle uncertainty. The self that doesn't need external validation. The self that can love without possessing, create without attachment to outcomes, exist without constantly defending some fabricated identity. And the only way to access this self? You have to let go of everything you think you are and reclaim your shadow projections. Jung's approach to this was radically different from Freud's psychoanalysis. While Freud focused on repressed sexual and aggressive drives, Jung realized that the psyche's primary drive is toward wholeness, what he called individuation. Individuation isn't about becoming a better version of your current self. It's about becoming who you actually are beneath all the personas, complexes, and shadow projections. And that means letting go of every false identity you've constructed to protect yourself from the uncertainty of existence. Here's what Jung discovered during his own individuation process, the period he later documented in his famous Red Book, and this is where it gets really practical for your life. Every single attachment you have is actually a defense mechanism against facing some aspect of reality you don't want to accept. That job you're clinging to even though it's killing your soul? You're using it to avoid facing your fear of financial insecurity and your shadow's desire for creative expression. That relationship you won't let go of even though it's toxic? You're using it to avoid facing your fear of being alone with yourself and your shadow's capacity for independence. That version of yourself you used to be that you keep trying to get back to? You're using that nostalgia to avoid facing who you're becoming and the shadow potential that's trying to emerge. During Jung's confrontation with the unconscious, the period from 1913 to 1919 that he later called his creative illness, he developed techniques that would revolutionize psychology. He wasn't just sitting in his office theorizing. He was actively engaging with his own psyche in ways that bordered on shamanic practice. He started having conversations with figures that emerged from his unconscious. Not metaphorically. Jung literally engaged in dialogue with autonomous figures like Philemon, an old man with the horns of a bull and the wings of a kingfisher, who became Jung's inner guide and teacher. Through these dialogues, Jung realized that what we call letting go isn't actually about releasing anything. It's about integrating the energy that's been bound up in our attachments and shadow projections. Philemon taught Jung something profound. You think you are the master of your thoughts, but your thoughts think you. This insight completely changed Jung's understanding of the psyche. We're not in control of our minds the way we think we are. Our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are being driven by autonomous complexes that operate like separate personalities. And here's the revolutionary part. Jung discovered that you can actually negotiate with these complexes. Instead of fighting against your attachments or trying to suppress them through willpower, you can enter into dialogue with them. This is what Jung called active imagination, a technique that goes way beyond visualization or positive thinking. This is about having actual conversations with the parts of your psyche that are keeping you stuck. Here's how Jung developed this technique. He would sit quietly and allow images, figures, or scenarios to emerge from his unconscious. Then, instead of just observing them passively, he would engage with them as if they were real people. He'd ask them questions, listen to their responses, even argue with them when necessary. What Jung discovered through this process was mind-blowing. These inner figures had their own perspectives, their own agendas, their own wisdom. They weren't just random products of his imagination. They were autonomous aspects of his psyche that had been split off and were operating independently. And many of these figures were connected to things he couldn't let go of. Old relationships, failed projects, suppressed aspects of his personality. They had all become personified as inner figures that were influencing his behavior from the unconscious. Through active imagination, Jung learned to negotiate with these figures. Instead of being controlled by his attachments, he could understand what they wanted, what they were afraid of, what they needed in order to be integrated rather than remaining as autonomous complexes. But Jung discovered something even more powerful through his Red Book work. He realized that every attachment contains within it the seed of its own transcendence. The very thing you can't let go of is actually trying to teach you something that will make letting go unnecessary. Let me explain this with an example that'll probably blow your mind. Let's say you can't let go of a relationship that ended badly. Traditional therapy might focus on processing your grief or changing your thought patterns. But Jung's approach would be radically different. He'd have you personify your attachment to this person. Give it a face, a voice, a personality. Then you'd enter into active imagination dialogue with this figure. You might discover that your attachment isn't really about the person at all. It's about some aspect of your shadow that you projected onto them. Maybe this person represented your shadow's capacity for emotional intensity, something you've been taught to suppress. Maybe they represented your shadow's desire for adventure or creativity or authenticity. Maybe they were carrying some aspect of your unlived life. Through the active imagination dialogue, you'd negotiate with this attachment figure. You'd ask it what it wants, what it's afraid of, what it needs from you. And often, Jung found, the figure would reveal that what it really wants isn't the external person at all. It wants you to reclaim and integrate the shadow qualities you've been projecting. Once you integrate these shadow qualities, once you allow yourself to be emotionally intense, or adventurous, or creative, or authentic, the attachment naturally dissolves. You don't need to force letting go anymore, because you've reclaimed the parts of yourself you were seeking in the other person. Jung called this process withdrawal of projections. And it's not just about romantic relationships. This same dynamic applies to career attachments, money attachments, identity attachments. All of them are usually shadow projections in disguise. But here's where Jung's Red Book teachings get really mystical. During his confrontation with the unconscious, Jung discovered that individual psychology and collective psychology are not separate things. When you work with your personal shadow and complexes, you're also working with what he called the collective unconscious, the shared psychological patterns that run through all of humanity. This means that when you're struggling to let go of something, you're not just fighting your own psychology. You're fighting against archetypal patterns that have been running through human consciousness for thousands of years. The lover who can't release the beloved. The hero who can't let go of past victories. The mother who can't let her children grow up. The father who can't stop trying to control outcomes. These aren't just personal patterns. They're archetypal patterns that exist in the collective unconscious. Jung identified dozens of these archetypes through his analytical work and his exploration of mythology, religion, and alchemy. Each archetype has both a positive and shadow aspect, and our personal attachments often get entangled with archetypal energies. For example, if you can't let go of a romantic relationship, you might be possessed by the lover archetype. The positive aspect of the lover seeks union and connection. But the shadow aspect of the lover becomes obsessive, possessive, and loses individual identity in relationship. Jung discovered that you can't resolve archetypal possession through personal effort alone. You have to engage with the archetypal level of the psyche directly. This is why traditional therapy often fails with deep attachments. It's working at the personal level when the real issue is archetypal. Through his Red Book work, Jung developed techniques for engaging with archetypal energies directly. He would enter into active imagination with archetypal figures, learning to differentiate between personal and archetypal material, and finding ways to honor archetypal energies without being possessed by them. This is where Jung's understanding of letting go becomes truly profound. He realized that most of what we call attachment is actually archetypal possession. We're not just attached to people or outcomes. We're possessed by archetypal energies that are using our personal situations as vessels for expression. When you can't let go of someone, you're often possessed by an archetypal pattern. The shadow mother who can't release her children. The shadow father who must control everything. The shadow lover who must possess the beloved. The shadow hero who can't accept defeat. Jung's approach was to help people recognize when they were possessed by archetypal energies, then learn to engage with these energies consciously rather than being unconsciously driven by them. But Jung made another crucial discovery during his Red Book period. He found that archetypal energies aren't just psychological patterns. They're also spiritual forces that connect us to something larger than our individual ego. When we learn to engage with archetypes consciously, we gain access to transpersonal wisdom and power. This is where Jung's psychology becomes profoundly spiritual without being religious. He discovered that the individuation process, the journey toward psychological wholeness, is simultaneously a spiritual journey toward what he called the realization of the self. The self, in Jung's terminology, isn't the ego self we normally identify with. It's the archetype of wholeness, the deeper organizing principle that orchestrates our psychological development. And the self has a very different relationship to attachment than the ego does. The ego seeks to possess, control, and maintain. The self seeks to experience, integrate, and transform. When you learn to let go at the ego level, you're actually opening to the self's way of being in the world. Jung discovered this through his own process of what he called transcendent function, the psyche's ability to hold the tension between opposing forces until a third thing emerges that transcends the original conflict. Instead of either clinging to something or rejecting it, Jung learned to hold both the attachment and the desire for freedom simultaneously. He would engage with the tension between these opposites through active imagination, allowing the psyche's wisdom to generate a transcendent solution. This isn't a mental process. It's a lived experience of allowing the psyche's natural healing intelligence to operate. Jung found that when he stopped trying to solve problems with his ego and started trusting the transcendent function, solutions would emerge that he never could have figured out rationally. But the transcendent function doesn't just resolve individual attachments. Jung discovered that it actually rewires your entire relationship with attachment itself. Once you've successfully used this process a few times, you start to trust that letting go doesn't mean losing something. It means creating space for something more authentic to emerge. This is where Jung's psychology intersects with what he called synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that seem to connect inner psychological states with outer events. Jung noticed that when people successfully engage with their shadow material and learn to let go of ego attachments, they start experiencing synchronistic events. It's as if the universe starts conspiring to support their individuation process. But Jung's understanding of synchronicity goes deeper than just receiving signs and meaningful coincidences. He saw synchronicity as evidence that psyche and matter are two aspects of the same underlying reality, what he called the unus mundus, or unified world. When you're attached to something, you're fighting against the natural flow of this unified reality. You're trying to force outcomes based on your limited ego perspective instead of allowing yourself to flow with the deeper intelligence that orchestrates both psychological development and external circumstances. But when you learn to let go at the ego level and trust the self's guidance, you start moving in harmony with this deeper intelligence. Your outer life begins to align with your inner psychological development in ways that seem magical but are actually the natural result of living from your authentic center. Jung experienced this dramatically during his Red Book period. As he let go of his attachment to conventional success and reputation, opportunities emerged that aligned perfectly with his deeper calling. Publishers appeared when he needed them. Patients arrived who challenged him to grow. Synchronistic events guided his research in directions that proved crucial for his later theoretical developments. But Jung wasn't naive about the letting go process. Through his clinical work, he discovered that there's a dark side to individuation that most spiritual teachers won't tell you about. When you start letting go of your ego attachments and engaging with shadow material, you don't just release things that are obviously harmful. You also have to let go of things that have been providing you with identity, meaning, and a sense of purpose. Jung went through what he called the dark night of the soul, periods during his individuation process where he questioned everything: his career, his relationships, his sanity, even his will to live. He realized these weren't obstacles to growth. They were necessary parts of the process. Because here's what Jung discovered through his own experience and his work with patients: you can't selectively let go. You can't keep the parts of your ego identity that feel good and only release the parts that cause suffering. Individuation is an all-or-nothing process. When you truly commit to psychological wholeness, you're committing to the death and rebirth of your entire sense of self. And that means going through periods where you literally don't know who you are anymore. Jung called these periods psychological death, the necessary dissolution of ego structures that have outlived their usefulness. But he made a crucial distinction between psychological death that serves individuation and what he called psychological inflation, or deflation. Inflation happens when the ego identifies with archetypal content, when you think you are the archetypal energy rather than being temporarily possessed by it. This leads to grandiosity, megalomania, and eventually a crash when reality reasserts itself. Deflation happens when the ego is overwhelmed by archetypal content and completely loses its boundaries. This leads to depression, anxiety, psychosis, and what Jung called possession by the unconscious. Healthy individuation involves learning to dance between these extremes, maintaining ego consciousness while remaining open to transpersonal energies, holding your individual identity while participating in something larger than yourself. Jung developed specific criteria for recognizing healthy individuation versus pathological possession. People going through healthy individuation become more integrated, more creative, more compassionate. They develop what Jung called psychological flexibility, the ability to move fluidly between different psychological states without being trapped in any of them. But people experiencing pathological possession become more rigid, more identified with their particular psychological content, more disconnected from others. They lose the ability to observe their own psychological processes objectively. The difference comes down to whether your letting go process is serving the self's drive toward wholeness or feeding the ego's desire to avoid responsibility and growth. Jung found that true individuation always leads to what he called the realization of the self, a state of consciousness where you're in direct contact with the organizing principle of your psyche. People who reach this state don't need to strategize their lives because they're plugged into the intelligence that's orchestrating their development. They don't need to control outcomes because they trust the process that's unfolding through them. But this isn't passive. Jung emphasized that self-realization leads to what he called conscious participation in your own becoming. You become what Jung called a conscious instrument of the self, someone who can channel archetypal energies creatively rather than being unconsciously possessed by them. Your work becomes an expression of your deeper purpose rather than just a survival strategy. Your relationships become opportunities for mutual individuation rather than unconscious projection and attachment. Jung had several patients who reached this state during their analysis with him. He noticed that they all shared certain characteristics. They had learned to hold paradox without needing to resolve it immediately. They could love deeply without possessing. They could engage passionately without attachment to outcomes. Most importantly, they had developed what Jung called the transcendent attitude, a perspective that could hold both personal and transpersonal levels of reality simultaneously. They remained grounded in their individual humanity while participating consciously in archetypal and collective processes. Jung saw this as the goal of analytical psychology, not to cure symptoms or adjust people to social norms, but to facilitate the individuation process that leads to psychological wholeness and conscious participation in the larger patterns of existence. But Jung's deepest insight about letting go came through his study of alchemy and Eastern philosophy during the later part of his career. He realized that what Western psychology calls individuation is actually a universal process that's been understood by wisdom traditions throughout history. The alchemists called it the opus contra naturam, the work against nature that paradoxically aligns you with nature's deeper intelligence. Eastern traditions call it liberation or enlightenment, the release from ego identification that reveals your true nature. Jung discovered that all these traditions understand the same fundamental truth. What we call self is actually a collection of identifications, projections, and attachments that obscure our deeper nature. And what we call letting go is actually the natural movement of consciousness toward its source. But Jung's contribution was to map this process psychologically, showing how universal spiritual principles operate through specific psychological mechanisms. He showed how shadow work, complex integration, archetypal engagement, and active imagination can facilitate the same liberation that mystics achieve through meditation and contemplation. This is why Jung's approach to letting go is so powerful. It's not just spiritual bypassing or positive thinking. It's a practical method for working with the actual psychological structures that keep us trapped in patterns of attachment and suffering. When you learn to dialogue with your complexes through active imagination, you're not just talking to yourself. You're engaging with autonomous aspects of the collective psyche that have been operating through your personal psychology. When you withdraw your shadow projections from external people and situations, you're not just improving your relationships. You're reclaiming parts of the collective human wholeness that have been fragmented and projected outward. When you learn to channel archetypal energies consciously rather than being possessed by them unconsciously, you're not just developing psychological health. You're participating in the evolution of human consciousness itself. This is what Jung meant when he called individuation the great work. It's not just personal development. It's humanity's evolutionary project of becoming conscious. Every person who completes their own individuation process makes it easier for others to do the same. Your willingness to face your shadow, integrate your complexes, and let go of ego attachments is literally contributing to the collective awakening of human consciousness. You're helping to create a world where people can love without possessing, create without attachment to outcomes, and exist without constantly defending fabricated identities. And in a world that's increasingly fragmented by unconscious projection, archetypal possession, and collective shadow material, maybe Jung's approach to letting go is exactly what we need. Because when you learn to let go the way Jung understood it, not as passive surrender but as conscious integration, you become what he called a bridge between the conscious and unconscious realms. You become someone who can hold space for others to face their own shadow material. Someone who can recognize archetypal possession and help people differentiate between personal and transpersonal content. Someone who can facilitate the individuation process that leads to genuine psychological freedom. So what are you going to let go of today? And more importantly, what shadow qualities are you going to reclaim in the process?